Sustainability Defined would like to thank Island Press for sponsoring this episode. Island Press is the nation's leading publisher of books on environmental issues. It is a 501c3 organization with a mission to stimulate, shape, and communicate the information that is essential for solving environmental problems. It has over 1,000 titles in print and some 30 new releases each year.
If you'd like to learn more about Island Press, as well as their publication called Vacant to Vibrant, which we discussed in this episode, check out islandpress.org/vibrant. Sustainability Defined listeners can use the discount code VIBRANT, in all caps, VIBRANT, at checkout for 20% off the cover price. This episode is also sponsored by Holden Forests and Gardens, with generous support from the Great Lakes Protection Fund. Holden Forests and Gardens connects people with the wonder, beauty, and value of trees and plants to inspire action for healthy communities. The Great Lakes Protection Fund identifies, demonstrates, and promotes regional action to enhance the health of the Great Lakes ecosystem. All right, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Jay and I are still here defining sustainability one concept and one bad joke at a time. We are past the episode 50 hump. We are on episode 51, and this one is about urban greening. So, Jay, tell us about how we are trying to green our urban areas. What are we going to talk about?
That's right, Scott. And quickly, episode 51, we're aging as a podcast, but we're aging gracefully, right? All right, so let's run through our outline of our episode today. So number one, we're going to ask, what is urban greening? Then we will ask, how common is urban green space generally? Then ask, why is urban greening important? Then
we have so many questions on the show.
I hope you're inquisitive today, folks, because a whole bunch of questions. Anyway, Scott, we are then branching, of course, into urban greening on vacant land in particular. And then we will introduce Vacant to Vibrant, which you heard at the very top of the episode. Then we'll examine what are the success factors and challenges for urban greening initiatives. Finally, we'll move to how you can promote urban greening in your neighborhood and transition into a summary of Island Press and Sandra Albro, our guest coming up later. So, Scott, start us off from square one. What is urban greening?
Okay, so the term urban greening, also called green infrastructure, refers to public landscaping and urban forestry projects that create mutually beneficial relationships between city dwellers and their environments. The most common forms of urban greening are installing trees, parks, and landscaped green areas, oftentimes in newly built urban areas. However, not all urban greening happens in new developments. There are plenty of examples of urban greening retrofits where older urban infrastructure has been revitalized with a green thumb. I love that phrase, green thumb.
And Scott, speaking of these green thumbs, one of the most famous examples of this is New York City's High Line Park. So for background, the High Line was originally built as an elevated rail line that carried trains through the west side of New York City in the early 1930s. As train use dwindled from the 1960s to the 1980s, the structure fell into disrepair and sat idle for decades. Then in the early 2000s, chatter began about how to capitalize on the park as an urban green space. Today, after years of effort, the High Line is a 1.5-mile greenway featuring 500 species of plants and trees and hosts thousands of visitors each year.
Have you been there, Jay?
I have. It is actually really very cool.
Very cool. So many interesting plants. It's also very romantic.
Oh, Scott.
I mean, I'm a date planner, Jay.
Date ideas. Actually, that's not too far off, Scott. You did have an app for a while that was going to do just that.
Yes. That was, like many things, you have an idea, you think it could be cool, and it just doesn't quite come. So
if our listeners could just be lucky enough to go on a date with you, man, I think we'd be in a different place.
Right, I guess I'd have to talk with Shannon before we auction off that. So, Jay, how common is urban green space in the first place? Well, the goal of urban greening is to create functional green space for city dwellers. Some cities have done a better job of incorporating green space within their boundaries than others. To contextualize this, let's start by expressing parks and gardens as a percentage of total land area. Looking globally, major world cities with the highest percentages of public green space include Moscow at 54%. I remember visiting Moscow and being super impressed, both my brother and I, with the amount of green space that they have. So not surprised to see
Over half.
I know,
Yeah, it's cool.
I know. But if you go there, you won't be surprised by that stat. Singapore at 47% and Sydney at 46%. Cities with the smallest percentages include Shanghai at 2.8%, Istanbul at 2.2%, and Dubai at 2%.
Here in the US, New York has the highest percentage at 27%, which I know is kind of interesting when you don't really think about that when you think about the whole concrete jungle, right? Right, but you just have one enormous park for everybody.
Yeah.
On the other end of the spectrum, we have Los Angeles with only 6.7% of green space per total land area. Austin, Texas, situated right between them with 15% of total land area dedicated to public green space.
Yet another reason to not really like LA. I hate you gotta drive everywhere.
That's actually surprising to me, Scott. I mean, you think LA, in my mind, I envision more greenery than in New York, but clearly that that's pretty backwards. Another way to quantify how much urban green space a city offers its inhabitants is on a per capita basis. So let's zoom into the US specifically for this one. Scott, we're going to run down the top 5 cities here and let's see how well you do. Actually, real quick, see if you can pick off as many cities as you can in the top 5 off the top of your head.
I mean, I have to think my home city of Chicago is on there. I have to think DC is on there. I don't know. I'm just thinking of, I guess, cities I'm familiar with. Madison, if that is large enough, but...
Well, that's okay, Scott. You can't be familiar with all cities in the U.S. So number 5, Scott, we've got Nashville at 1.3 acres of green space per capita. Then, Scott, number 4, we've got your hometown, Washington, D.C. There it is, 1.4 acres per capita. Number 3, Cincinnati, 1.6 acres per capita. Number 2, Kansas City, 2.13 acres per capita. It's not just good barbecue there. It's also green space. And number 1 is Minneapolis, 2.43 acres of green space per capita. I don't think I expected that at all.
Well, I haven't been to Minneapolis. I should have thought of that. I haven't been to Kansas City or Cincinnati, though. So, okay. So these stats, Jay, they're one thing. But just because a city has a lot of green space doesn't mean that green space is equally accessible to all of a city's inhabitants. In fact, a recent University of British Columbia study revealed that access to green space reflects broader class and racial divides. Residents with higher levels of education and higher incomes are more likely to have access to green space, while minority residents are less likely to have similar access to green space in large, dense urban areas. Because the distribution of green space often disproportionately benefits predominantly white and more affluent communities, access to green space is increasingly recognized as an environmental justice issue. That's a topic we could do a whole episode on, Jay.
Absolutely.
And this makes the aim of the Vacant to Vibrant project so pressing, which we'll explore in more detail in just a bit.
So, Scott, let's ask, why is urban greening and urban green space important in the first place? So let's start on the human health side. A growing body of evidence shows a relationship between amounts of neighborhood green space and people's health and well-being. Specifically, access to green space can promote physiological effects such as lower concentrations of cortisol, which is your body's main stress hormone, lower pulse rate and blood pressure, and healthier nerve activity. Proximity to parks has also been associated with greater frequency of physical activity, reduced weight, and lower coronary heart disease. On the flip side, lower exposure to green space has been associated with a number of lifestyle diseases, such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, and stress-related illnesses, such as depression, heart diseases, and mental fatigue. No, Scott, I'm not reading off some drug ad and listing side effects. This is actually real things associated with the lack of green space.
No, and the benefits just keep going, Jay. I mean, they're not just physical. A number of studies link exposure to green space with mental health benefits, like an improved mood, self-esteem, reduced stress, reduced cognitive fatigue, and greater attention capacity. In fact, one study in Philadelphia found that in neighborhoods below the poverty line, greening interventions on vacant lots decreased residents' feelings of depression by more than 68%. This is why even amid the coronavirus, Jay, it's important to get that walk outside.
Absolutely.
Now, here's one more impressive example to underscore the benefits of urban green space. One study based in Toronto that analyzed density of trees throughout the city as a metric for green space found that having 10 more trees in a city block, on average, improves health perception. That's the subjective self-rating that has been proven to be a strong predictor of actual health status. And it improves that health perception in ways comparable to an increase in annual personal income of $10,000 or being 7 years younger. That's amazing. I want to feel 7
Scott,
years younger.
I got to ask, which would you take, 10 grand or 7 years younger?
7 years, like literally 7 years younger? Or just feeling it?
I'm sorry, feeling 7 years younger.
I guess it depends how long I feel that way, but yeah, I want to feel young. Maybe my lower back pain will go away. That'd be great.
So, listeners, basically what we can say here is that access to green space is so healthy that it might as well be a vitamin to add to your diet.
Well, it's funny you say that, Jay. Actually, one of my favorite authors, Richard Louv, he actually coined the term nature deficit disorder, which we did a whole episode on. He wrote a whole book on vitamin N, which is nature. So people should look that up too. It's a really good book.
So, Scott, we're not done.
No.
Far from
Buckle
done.
up.
Buckle up. Beyond human health, urban green spaces also carry larger environmental benefits, of course. First, these green spaces mitigate the effects of the urban heat island effect. As a refresher, the term urban heat island refers to the phenomenon where a metropolitan area is significantly warmer than the rural areas surrounding it. The heat island is driven by the density of buildings, the absorption of light by those buildings, and the relative lack of vegetation in cities. Get this. Release of heat absorbed during the day by asphalt and densely packed buildings can make the downtown area some 20 degrees warmer in some cities. Adding more green spaces to a city helps offset these higher temperatures. In fact, a mature tree canopy reduces air temperatures by about 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit on its own.
Wow. I mean, I think as we see more extreme heat temperatures with climate change and such, I know that this is part of what we need to address. This urban heat island effect just exacerbates that. So
Absolutely.
So in addition to mitigating the urban heat island effect, trees found in urban green spaces also do wonders for our air quality. So here's another potential party fact. Let's plug the party fact guide, Jay. We got the party fact guide.
Download yours today.
Oh, it's so good. So here's another one. 2 medium-sized healthy trees can supply the oxygen required for a single person over the course of a year. Beyond producing oxygen, trees also capture airborne particles like dirt, dust, and soot. A mature tree absorbs between 120 to 240 pounds of the small particles and gases that comprise air pollution. And Jay, did we say where people can download the party guide?
Listeners, sustainabilitydefined.com/partyfacts, and boom.
There we go. Okay. Additionally, urban green space helps regulate the flow of water through a city's watershed. So we've got the urban heat island effect, air quality, and now water. These green spaces intercept, absorb, and then slowly release water, which can reduce adverse impacts of stormwater runoff, like stream bank erosion, sediment transport, and the frequency and severity of floods and drought. This is particularly important because stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces is a main source of pollution that affects water quality around the U.S.
Listeners, are you still not sold?
They're not, Jay.
Somehow on urban greening, you're still not sold. Here are a couple economic benefits to urban greening just to add on top of everything else we've discussed.
Just put on that economic frosting on the whole cake.
That's right. Beautiful, Scott. So here's our economic frosting. Let's say this is like our carrot cake, right, that we alluded to in our last episode. So cream cheese frosting. Here we go. So listeners, remember all those health benefits we discussed earlier. Get this. Here in the United States, an evaluation of the largest 85 cities in the country found that health savings from parks was an estimated $3.1 billion.
Every episode, we always have billions of dollars in savings. I love it.
That's right. And this one, Scott, I love because you can kind of put that into context coming off of our hospitals and sustainability episode just this past month. Next, in Cleveland specifically, a conservative estimate of value found that an urban forest of about 30% tree canopy would provide the surrounding community approximately $44 million per year in improved air quality, energy saving, and health impact.
Plus, studies have tied economics to urban green spaces, specifically trees, as well. So, evaluating homes with similar features and varying amounts of surrounding trees, one study found there was a 6% increase in home values. that was associated with the presence of the trees. An increase of 3.5 to 4.5% was reported in another study. So this is a thing. Second, studies show that shoppers in business districts with robust tree canopy will spend 9 to 12% more for products, travel further, and spend more time there. So if you're a listener who happens to run a business improvement district, trees. Huh?
Great plug, Scott.
Thank you.
Love that. And of course, lastly, as we wrap up the section, we have to just state the obvious here, which is that urban green space just looks good, right? People enjoy it. It makes the city more beautiful. It's that simple.
I see trees admiring themselves in the mirror all the time.
I think I'm going to let the trees just embrace their own vanity. I'm fine with that.
Me too.
So, listeners, let's transition now into urban greening on vacant land and introduce vacant to vibrant. So, while urban greening can take place in a variety of settings, from busy street sidewalks to, as we discussed earlier, elevated rail lines, in this episode, we're focusing on the potential for urban greening on vacant land specifically. Why, might you ask?
Why, Jay?
Well, thank you, Scott. Here are two compelling reasons why vacant land is extremely well suited for urban greening.
All right, I'll go first. So the supply of vacant land in our cities is abundant and generally increasing. On average, nearly 1/6 of the land in U.S. cities is considered vacant, think like underutilized or uninhabited. Plus, the ratio of vacant land to city size in America increased by 1.3% from 1998 to 2016. This doesn't account for regional variations, so cities in the American South and Midwest have land vacancy rates of 24% and 21% respectively. That's so high. So there's tons of existing land suitable for greening.
Second, as to why vacant land is well suited for urban greening, well, vacant land as well as vacant homes can have traumatic impacts on neighborhoods and cities, serving as breeding grounds for drug abuse, crime, violence, things we know that pretty much nobody wants around their neighborhood. So get this, blocks with vacant properties face crime rates twice as high as blocks without them.
Wow.
This makes greening vacant land parcels a key element to larger community revitalization. It's this particular point that brings us to the emphasis of this episode on urban greening, which is the Vacant to Vibrant project.
Okay, so Vacant to Vibrant is a guidebook written by Sandra Albro based on an urban greening project she led of the same name. It was launched in 2009. The Vacant to Vibrant project, it aimed to transform vacant neighborhood lots into productive green infrastructure assets that simultaneously benefited their surrounding communities. The project focused on 3 post-industrial cities reinventing themselves after decades of lost jobs: Cleveland, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, and Gary, Indiana. I don't think I've been to any of those cities. Have you, Jay?
Ooh, embarrassingly, no.
No.
I have
Oh,
not.
geez.
Although, fun fact, I will say my girlfriend Anna was born in Cleveland, so that's probably a fact I should not be sharing.
Well, it's all right. The listeners won't tell anybody. These cities all... Why can't you share that?
I don't know. I think that's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll proclaim it. I've never been to Cleveland.
Okay. So these cities all shared 3 critical elements relative to Vacant to Vibrant's project goals: large quantities of vacant land that were unproductive and expensive to maintain, outdated sewer systems that were creating a need for better stormwater management in the face of a changing climate, and last, neighborhoods that had weathered the environmental and social effects of decades of industrial decline, and in the case of one city, the loss of an Anna.
Somehow not mentioned in the book. So let's quickly highlight Vacant to Vibrant's methodology to understand why the project provides such a valuable framework through which to analyze urban greening. So in each of the 3 selected cities we talked about, the project team selected vacant parcels they determined to be best positioned for urban greening based on a number of criteria. Then they examined each parcel along the following 3 lines to deeply understand the best urban greening solution for that particular lot. Number 1 is cultural history, understanding how each vacant lot's surrounding neighborhood originally developed, things like who lived there, what their socioeconomic status was, etc. Number 2 is physical form, examining soil types, contamination, and other characteristics of the land itself. And finally, number 3 is neighborhood context, identifying which local organizations are active in the area, how close the site is to existing infrastructure, etc.
Yeah, what's cool is in the book, they kind of did some interesting background of each of the cities. It was kind of cool to get some history there. So what makes Vacant to Vibrant unique from many other urban greening projects is its equal emphasis on the social and the environmental needs of urban residents. And we'll use the lessons learned by the Vacant to Vibrant initiative as a lens to better understand what makes successful community-based urban greening initiatives. Hence, Jay, the next question we're going to ask: what are the success factors and challenges for urban greening initiatives? Well,
so methodical, so strategic.
It's just so well laid out. I don't know who wrote this. Must have been Jay. Jay did it, everybody.
Hey.
All right. So through its in-depth case studies from Cleveland, Buffalo, and Gary, Vacant to Vibrant identifies the critical success factors to urban greening projects on vacant land based on the challenges the project faced over its years of design and implementation. So, Jay, let's touch on our two favorites. Tell us number one.
Right. So number one, as far as success factors, is evaluate the effectiveness of urban greening projects and make adjustments to design post-installation. So what that means is sometimes certain green stormwater infrastructure elements don't quite work exactly as planned.
It's the same in life, too.
So true.
Your life plans.
Green stormwater infrastructure as a metaphor for life.
There you go.
The Vacant to Vibrant team found it helpful to leave room for adjustments to their design based on what they observed firsthand. So, for example, rain gardens designed to capture excess water runoff during storms typically work well. But the Vacant to Vibrant team found that increasing the permeability of the existing soils itself by adding leaf compost actually achieved the same result in a much more cost-effective way.
Okay, and number two is enlist the community in shaping the design of the projects to combat gentrification and strengthen neighborhoods. This is really another life correlator, Jay. You got to have a strong community, right? You got to rely on them, let them help you out.
So true.
Okay, so in our episode number 41 on equity in cities, we touched on the topic of green gentrification. This refers to the creation of new green space that's intended to address environmental justice problems. So while these new spaces can make neighborhoods healthier, more aesthetically attractive, it can also increase housing costs and property values. And ultimately, this can lead to gentrification and a displacement of the very residents the green space strategies were designed to benefit.
Right. So it's backwards, Scott, but it's therefore pretty understandable that many residents that Vacant to Vibrant coordinated with expressed real concern about these projects. Mm-hmm. The Vacant to Vibrant team found that understanding the histories of their post-industrial neighborhoods, for example, how they were developed and the types of residents who have historically benefited from development and those that have been excluded, in addition to keeping community dialogue open and utilizing community liaisons, can help these projects sensitively navigate resident concerns about change.
Okay, so scaling this focus on equity in project planning by elevating equitable urban green space to the level of long-term regional planning is especially important. As a first step, many cities are committing to long-term urban greening initiatives. For example, Pittsburgh's 12-part, 25-year plan that has an open space component called Open Space PGH that details land use and infrastructure decisions that affect the city's 30,000 vacant, distressed, or undeveloped properties. The plan identifies lack of adequate green space as a growing threat.
So, listener, you might be there sitting, listening to this podcast thinking, how can I promote urban greening in my city or neighborhood?
Yeah.
Well, Scott, do we have the next section for you? How can you promote this yourself? Well, number one is simply launching urban greening projects yourself. We found a great article by the nonprofit IOBI that walks through 3 easy projects that you can start today. They include creating a community garden, banding together with neighbors to create bicycle and pedestrian promenades over de-emphasizing the car, and creating multi-purpose community spaces on vacant lots just like Vacant to Vibrant. We will link to this article in our show notes on our website.
You can also get involved in your city government or in community groups to champion these sort of projects on a greater scale. Many cities have some sort of public health department that focuses directly on the health of its citizens. In Jay's city of Denver, it's called the Department of Public Health and Environment, And they have all kinds of resources and upcoming events and partner organizations on their website. And that tells you something, that they call the department Public Health and Environment, that they see the overlap.
Absolutely.
There are also all sorts of neighborhood nonprofits that exist to promote healthy communities on a more micro scale. Finding them is no harder than Googling sustainable community development groups or Googling urban greening groups near me.
In fact, Scott, there may already be groups providing urban greening services to organizations in your neighborhood that you can engage with directly. One example is Greenprint Partners, which consults for cities, water authorities, and property owners on how best to realize the fullest green infrastructure potential. Another example is the Trust for Public Lands 10-Minute Walk National Campaign. Their goal is to have a park within a 10-minute walk of all homes in America.
And finally, you can get politically active. Vote for politicians that express support for urban greening. And of course, don't forget to check out our episode on climate advocacy for additional tips on how to amplify your passion for urban greening. All right, lastly, Jay, let's talk about Island Press and Sandra Albro. So Island Press, it's the nation's leading publisher of books on environmental issues like Vacant to Vibrant. It is a 501c3 organization with a mission to stimulate, shape, and communicate the information that is essential for solving environmental problems.
Sandra Albro, our upcoming guest and author and project manager of Vacant to Vibrant, is the director of community partnerships at Holden Forests and Gardens. She's also the co-chair for the Cleveland Tree Coalition and the project manager for a U.S. EPA Urban Waters project examining the use of soil remediation and green stormwater infrastructure in Cleveland. Clearly, she knows her stuff. She's got quite an array of impressive titles, and we are excited to speak with her. All right, listeners, we are now joined by Sandra Albro, who is the Director of Community Partnerships at Holden Forests and Gardens, as well as the Project Manager for Vacant to Vibrant. So, Sandra, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here talking with you today.
Excellent. So, Sandra, this is a great timing for this episode because our last episode was on hospitals and sustainability, and it turns out, in looking at your background, you started your career in nursing before moving over to ecological research. So what got you interested in nursing as it follows on the heels of our hospitals episode? And then how did that evolve into an interest in the natural environment?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in the natural environment. I grew up in rural Oregon, so I had a childhood full of the natural environment. I think coming from a family that I was the first to go to college, there was this push to be a doctor or a lawyer or some sort of professional like that. So I was studying to become a nurse practitioner. And through my work at university hospitals in Cleveland, I discovered that I was good at healthcare, but it just wasn't the career for me. So I turned back to biology, which is what I studied as an undergraduate. And that led me into a master's degree in plant ecology.
And do you still hear sometimes from your parents like, oh, you could have been a doctor or a lawyer?
I think they've kind of given up on that. But yeah.
Well, I mean, what you're doing is amazing. I imagine that you've converted them to being stormwater advocates and trying to address that issue. And we know you have an expertise around that. So could you tell us a bit about how you developed that expertise and maybe one of your favorite projects, like urban greening projects around stormwater, just to kind of segue into more of a focus on urban greening?
Yes, early in the project, or actually early in my role at Holden Forests and Gardens, I was looking at vacant land use, and that kind of sprang out of our urban farming program. So early on, I was looking mostly at soil contamination remediation and urban farms as biodiversity hotspots. And in the early parts of this project, we received a small grant to hold a multi-city conversation about vacant land use and how that could be used to benefit cities ecologically and socially. And that sprang out of the urban farming work that we were doing at the garden at the time. And so in these conversations with professionals from 11 different Great Lakes cities, we were hearing from them that stormwater management was an issue that was at the forefront of their minds in terms of environmental needs that they had. And a lot of that was driven by some of the consent decrees that EPA was pushing through at the time around combined sewer overflow. So we heard from them that stormwater management was an environmental issue of interest to them. And that's what led me to start looking into that and what role vacant parcels might play in that.
So consent decrees being when EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, says, hey, you're not complying with Clean Water Act requirements, what are you going to do about it? They say, oh, we're struggling with this and that. Here's what we'll do. And then they sort of come to an agreement on what's going to happen to get there. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So in Cleveland, we entered into a consent decree in 2011, and we were one of the first sewer authorities that embraced green infrastructure as a solution specifically for their consent decree. And since then, it's become a lot more common.
And Sandra, are there any examples of urban greening projects that address stormwater that stand out to you as favorites?
Yeah. One of the early inspirations for Vacant to Vibrant was the Menominee Valley Stormwater Park in Milwaukee. It's an industrial area where they added just a lot of stormwater management around a stream that flows through this industrial park, and they were able to attract businesses down there, and it just became a really interesting juxtaposition of like light industry with these beautiful marshes. That really inspired us. I also really like in Cleveland, our sewer district has been doing a lot of green infrastructure, of course, related to our consent decree. And the Fleet Avenue Green Infrastructure Project is pretty small, but it takes a lot of stormwater from the adjacent street and filters that through these channels that go between big rocks and plants that are just right on the street there. And so it's fun to watch it during a storm fill up and kind of filter through.
Yeah, I mean, some people are watching the lightning and you're watching the water, channel through the Urban Greening Project.
Yes.
So, Sandra, you were talking about this meeting of these Great Lake cities and how they were telling you that stormwater management is an increasingly important issue to them. So we talked about Vacant to Vibrant at the top of the show, but could you tell us a bit more about the genesis? That was the beginning, right? This meeting, and then it went from there?
Yeah. So we started with these multi-city conversations about the overlap between vacant land and different social and environmental issues that they were looking at. And in our tour of cities, after they told us that stormwater management was important to them, we toured 6 different Great Lakes cities, looked at their stormwater management programs, and toured the areas that had a lot of vacancy. And we noticed that there just wasn't a lot of overlap back in 2011 between these two types of problems. So we weren't seeing a lot of the green infrastructure being built in areas that had a lot of residential vacancy. And that's since changed. But at the time we were noticing like, hey, is it possible for this investment in green infrastructure to be used to solve some of the residential vacancy that these cities are dealing with and to help stabilize neighborhoods that had gone through decades of decline?
Excellent. And so, Sandra, then you saw this opportunity, took the helm as its project manager, and really ran with it and produced this book, again, called Vacant to Vibrant, that our listeners can get copies of themselves. What I'm curious about, Sandra, is about one of the main objectives of Vacant to Vibrant, which was to test whether disparate land uses, in this case being neighborhood recreation and stormwater management, could actually coexist on a small vacant parcel of land in these residential areas that you talk about. So, in a nutshell, how would you summarize what you learned about this objective over the course of the project? And do you think it's successful to really combine them both?
Yes. So the types of land vacancy that are really common in residential areas are these small residential parcels, usually about 1/8 of an acre in size. And they come into existence through, of course, demolition of houses, and that can take place at different points in time. So you have these individual parcels kind of coming online at different points in time. They may or may not be connected to each other. So it can be very difficult to figure out how to use them. In some places, cities are trying to aggregate the parcels to find a good use for them. But early on in the project, we just observed that, these types of small parcels comprise like 85% of vacancy within a city. at least within the cities that we were working in. And so we wanted to figure out, like, is it possible to just use them as is? And what we learned is that it's possible to install, functional green infrastructure on these parcels and also combine that with recreational use. But it's important to start with the goal of the project and then work backwards to find a location that's appropriate for that type of land use. And many vacant land projects kind of start the other way. They start with a parcel that's in a prominent location, that's an eyesore, and people rally around, like, what are we going to do with this parcel? And only then, after they identify a project that they want to put on there and start breaking ground, that's when they start to find, contamination under the soil surface or other things that they weren't expecting that can really delay the project and inflate costs of the project. So for cost efficiency and also success, we think that it's really important to work backwards, to start with the goal and then to try to find parcels, that are good locations, that have good, slope, good soil characteristics, that are closely located to people where it can, benefit their lives also.
Yeah, no, but I could see where people would want to start with, here's this piece of land in a prominent area, it's an eyesore, let's fix it. But I see where the efficiencies could come in. But then are you saying that there's some vacant pieces of land that perhaps it just won't work for this sort of strategy, or at least to get the significant, exciting win-wins that your book is all about?
Yeah, I think that, again, for cost efficiency, and if you're really looking at vacant parcels as infrastructure, as a type of infrastructure that happens to be green, then yeah, it's important to work backwards. But certainly that doesn't stop residents, from coming together to tackle the eyesore vacant parcel on their block. They just may need to understand that, if there's contamination of the soil there, that could really limit the types of things that they're able to do.
Got it. And in your book, you go over projects in Cleveland and Buffalo and Gary. Is there one that you want to tell us about that does the best job of working backwards, of incorporating certain environmental strategies that our listeners could learn from?
Yeah, I would highlight a couple that were pretty different. So one of them is in
They're
Buffalo.
all your babies. I get it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're all my babies. So one of them is a larger vacant parcel compared, to the usual size. So it was like about a fifth of an acre instead of an eighth of an acre. And it was located close to an existing basketball court, but still in a quiet residential street. But it had a little bit more separation from adjacent houses than some of our other parcels. And the local community organization that we were working with, People United for Sustainable Housing in Buffalo, they're really cool if you want to check out their work. They had been talking about how to use this site and tie it into the basketball courts to kind of build a more of a park in the neighborhood. And they have a lot of immigrants in their neighborhood for whom handball is a cool sport for them to do. So I don't know personally how to play handball, but they wanted to build a handball court on this vacant parcel. It was a good location for stormwater management because you had the surface of the handball court, and you had this nice slope down into a rain garden and stormwater capture in the front. And kind of in between those two places was an area for picnic tables. So that's a good example of how, combining recreational use and stormwater management on one parcel. I would say another example that's pretty different that was much more, so handball is a very active recreational use. We also looked at more passive recreational uses. So in Gary, Indiana, there was this house that had been vacant for about 5 years, and it had at some point caught on fire.
Oh.
So it was a real eyesore. But in the back of the parcel was this beautiful walled garden made of decorative cinder block. And so early on, one of the advantages of working in Gary is that we were able to work before demolition to plan our site, around the features that were already there. So we were able to keep this walled garden in place even though the house was removed, and incorporate that into our site plans. And so for that, we had, again, a concrete slab with rain gardens interspersed within the garden, and then also a rain garden in the front. And that parcel also sloped down to the stormwater management feature in front. And then there was this nice picnic area or gathering space for the public in the back.
So you want to demolish a vacant building, you call the demolition experts, you call the rain garden experts. Got it.
Yes, exactly.
Sandra, I think one of my favorite pieces about really both those, but the handball court, is that because the handball court is positioned upslope from the picnic tables, if the handball gets lost and rolls down the hill, all that has to happen is the people that are sitting at the table just pick it up and throw it right back. I think that's just ingenious.
That's not something that we thought about in our plans, but it's definitely very convenient, I'm sure.
Sandra, let's shift now and focus kind of a little bit more on the environmental aspects here. So what types of environmental strategies did you find to be most successful when looking at vacant to vibrant projects?
I would highlight the plant nursery project in Buffalo as a good example of this. And so we had thought early on that we would want to incorporate downspout disconnections between, for all of the parcels.
What does that mean, downspout disconnections?
Yeah, a downspout disconnect it's kind of a diversion of stormwater from the downspout of an adjacent house. And rather than going into the sewer, which is where it normally goes in these cities, usually there's an ordinance that mandates that it has to go into the sewer. We would install kind of a diversion to route that stormwater into a rain garden that sits next to the house.
And the purpose of the rain garden then is to have it sink into the soil rather than being in an impervious surface where it would flow very fast into the stormwater drain. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the points of stormwater management and green infrastructure is to use soil and rocks to slow and filter stormwater rather than routing it into the sewer. So a downspout disconnect can be important because it kind of can reduce that volume of water that hits the system early and contributes to those overflows. And in the plant nursery in Buffalo, we were able to still incorporate a downspout disconnect that routed 2 houses into our rain garden. And we also planted that rain garden, kind of different from some of the other projects. We planted it with red osier dogwood, which is a multi-stem dogwood. So you have these big kind of shrubby trees with a lot of surface area to evapotranspire water. And what we noticed through our monitoring equipment is that this particular site just acted completely differently during a rainstorm and afterwards than the other sites. So what we could see through our monitoring equipment is that you get this influx of water during a rainstorm, and then you get this reverse movement of water over the next couple days as the roots of these red osier dogwoods pull water out of the soil and then evaporate it into the air through their leaves and branches. So I would say that in general, we learned a couple of things from this. Is that first, the downspout disconnect is really important for routing more water from impervious surfaces to the rain gardens, and that these types of woody plants can really move water in like very high volumes, much differently than grasses or a lot of the flowers that you see added to rain gardens.
Okay, so we talked evapotranspiration, which I was going to have you define, but you did in terms of the water coming up through the roots and then out through the leaves. Let's continue our ecology geekiness and continue talking about soils. So one of the things that was in the book was about how you looked at the demolition history of the site. And I know we already talked about blowing stuff up, which is always interesting. But tell us more about the issues with soil types. Like, why does that matter so much to these sort of projects? I think in Cleveland, you used what you call the 2-post demolition parcels. I mean, just tell us a bit more about why you need to know the demolition history and how a different type of soil impacts what you can do from an urban greening perspective.
Well, a central piece of green infrastructure. So like I said, green infrastructure uses plants, soils, and rocks to infiltrate water or hold it there. So you can have green infrastructure that just kind of slows the water before it runs into the sewer, or you can have green infrastructure that completely diverts water out of the sewer system entirely. But soils are central to green infrastructure, and so you really have to work with the soils that are there unless you replace them, which can be very costly. So in Cleveland and Buffalo, we have fingers of sandy soil and clay soils that kind of intermingle. And in areas where we have that clay in the soil that can really slow or impede the infiltration of water. So what can happen on clay soils is that you get a lot more runoff, and parcels are normally sloped to flow right into the street because, that's an important, flood mitigation. But if we're interested in keeping that water out of the sewer system, then we kind of want to change that. So that heavy clay can really keep water from soaking in. So in Cleveland and Buffalo, we're trying to use green infrastructure to infiltrate and store water below the surface. However, in Gary, Indiana, like the neighborhood that we were working in is built on a sand dune. It's surrounded by sand dunes. And so you have soil that's like 95% sand, and it moves water very quickly. And so in Gary, one of the reasons why I think their sewer system floods in some places is because you have this rainwater soaking into the sand very quickly and filling up the water table below, which can rise up and then can kind of find little breaks in the sewer system and flow into the sewers that way. So in Gary, one of the functions of a rain garden then might be to slow the water to keep it from moving into the ground too quickly, to kind of keep it more at the surface. And so you can kind of see through those two different examples that you really need to have a good understanding of the soils that are there so that you know how to, like, what the goal of your green infrastructure is. And then I would just say that, like, building and demolition history just can really change the soils that are there, because you have no idea until you break ground what soil has been brought in, like usually during the demolition process. So in some cities where demolition was happening very quickly and at a high rate, so like in Cleveland, we were demolishing 1,200 houses a year. The quality of the soil that was coming in was really variable, and sometimes it would just be these huge blocks of clay that just didn't infiltrate any soil. Plus you get like couches and building material and
couches.
Yeah, you find everything in a soil core in an urban area. So you also have to deal with all of that debris, underground storage tanks and contamination, tires, illegal dumping, other things that you can kind of find under the surface.
Sandra, I'm curious, what other kinds of things did you find under there? Was there something that
Did you ever
surprised
find money?
you the most? Maybe, right, or like at least like a matching ottoman for the couch?
It's just kind of a general rule that, like, you have no idea what you're going to find. I can't think of like a funnier example. It's a lot of, we find a lot of mattresses, like I mentioned, tires. Anything that costs money to dispose of will usually end up on a vacant parcel.
Absolutely. And all the contamination that might result. So Sandra, let's transition now into this community component of Vacant to Vibrant, which was, of course, a central theme to your research work. So is there a project that had an especially engaged group of neighbors that made up this community that helped see the project through to success, understanding how important these vacant parcels are to the neighborhoods that surround them?
I would say in Buffalo, where People United for Sustainable Housing had been engaging with neighbors a lot over several years around a lot of issues. They had deep engagement in the neighborhood, but there wasn't as much deep engagement about these projects because they were in the middle of conversations about everything else in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Cleveland and Gary, we were working in neighborhoods where these projects represented the first investment in their neighborhoods that they'd seen since probably the 60s.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so in Cleveland and Gary, we had a lot of engagement with neighbors that were very invested in these really small projects because it was the first investment they'd seen in so long. However, I would say that, engagement, especially in Cleveland, where we had a site that we had to modify after it was installed because the residents weren't that happy with it.
Well, we're going to get to the financial part of it, and like you said, it's really, we're not talking huge numbers here, but I'm curious about what you brought up with a project that actually needed to be changed because the neighbors weren't happy with it. I mean, can you talk a bit more about some challenges you've faced where maybe the neighbors said one thing and then they changed their mind, or I know you said the neighbors in Cleveland and Gary were super excited about it, but are there some where you're actually facing an uphill battle to put in this infrastructure?
In Cleveland, one of the parcels, it was a nature play site where we were trying to incorporate repurposed things like logs and other nature play elements like grassy hills and rock streams that we had used at the botanical garden is to create play spaces for children, and that had been used in other areas. In the end, the residents weren't that happy with the nature play concept. I think it was foreign to them. And when they compared it to like more traditional park equipment, they felt a little upset that they didn't get nice park equipment and instead got, this repurposed log. But I would say in general, like in Gary, another example of areas where residents weren't that happy or that were just difficult to deal with was just with the walled garden, for example. It had a gap where the garage used to be. So there wasn't a wall that went all the way across the parcel. And when that house came down, it had the visual effect of opening up the neighborhood to the streets beyond it. And it made residents feel very vulnerable. Like people could sneak in through our parcel and rob their houses and then sneak back out.
Wow.
Great lessons learned there, Sandra. And I think what is so interesting about all of these projects, and Scott alluded to this just a minute ago, is the financial side of them and how really the costs associated with them are relatively modest. Your projects, as you describe in the book, range from $7,000 to $35,000, which for quote urban infrastructure is really pretty inexpensive. The average of all the projects being just $18,000 between the 9 total projects. So 2 questions for you here. Number 1, did you notice a correlation between project quality and cost? And then number 2, what are the most cost-effective strategies that folks could use to bring urban greening to their own communities?
We didn't notice that quality was really correlated with cost as much as the type of recreational use. So more passive recreation. So, for example, flower gardens with maybe a bench or bird houses where people could sit and watch birds. That tended to be a bit more cost effective than, say, more active recreation. So the handball court was our most expensive project. Cost effective strategies, I would say there were 2 big takeaways for that. The first was really making sure that the maintenance contractors were involved with the design of the project so that they could look at site plans and be like, no, that's going to be very expensive for us to maintain, or we don't have the knowledge to do that. And then the second cost-effective piece was just avoiding moving earth as much as possible, because that was the most expensive piece of any of our projects.
As we look more generally now to what our listeners should leave this conversation better understanding about urban greening, what do you think is most important? What do you want them to leave as they think about the importance of these sort of projects?
I would want them to consider that to zoom out beyond the projects and to see that the health and wealth disparities that we see within urban neighborhoods that Vacant to Vibrant, kind of tried to address a little bit. These health and wealth disparities are only going to increase with climate change. And as urban populations grow, urban green space is going to become essential for things like mitigating heat island effect and absorbing stormwater, acting as habitat for birds and insects, and then also providing, recreational space for people for their mental and physical well-being. Really, our task is to try to find ways to build urban green space that has multiple purposes and to really be very clear about the costs and benefits of these urban green spaces so that we can provide, apples to apples comparisons with other types of pipes for stormwater management and development such as housing.
No, and I think it goes back to the importance of zooming out, like you were talking about earlier, that our listeners should try to do that. There's so many angles to this. And yes, let's play off the trends to capture people's attention and the needed funding. But ultimately, this has to be a comprehensive look. And that is what should ultimately change hearts and minds, is once you've incorporated all these different facets. So as our listeners think about that and all the different benefits that come from these sort of projects, what is the thing that they can most easily implement? Like, how should they go about creating change on the urban greening front where they live?
I would say another thing is to also just become more knowledgeable about how the environment is closely tied to social issues. Appearance of landscapes is what drives a lot of the health benefits. So if a green space looks well maintained and tidy, that reduces our stress, and that stress reduction is what leads to heart disease, improvements in populations.
So it sounds like advocate, learn, and appreciate.
Yes.
So, Sandra, as we move to wrap up this conversation, we are going to ask you our traditional party fact question that we ask of all of our guests. Although this party fact question is going to be a little bit different. We usually say to our guests, all right, let's say we're at a party hanging out and we want to share a particular stat or very compelling piece of information with partygoers that conveys the importance of urban greening. But clearly, following this conversation, we're playing handball. Okay, so let's envision that we're all playing handball. And again, I also don't know how handball works, but between rounds or points or whatever it is, let's say action calms, and we want to just use this opportunity to interject something, again, a stat or a very compelling piece of information to our players on the court that shows how important this topic is. What might that stat be?
Oh man, this is what makes us all so popular at parties.
I know, you got to share your secrets though with our listeners, Sandra. They want to be popular too.
A few years ago, it was estimated that approximately 24 billion gallons of combined sewer overflow were being discharged into the Great Lakes each year. And with this level of stormwater capture that we observed with the Vacant to Vibrant project, we estimate that it would take about 130,000 vacant to vibrant parcels to mitigate combined sewer overflow across the region. That would be at a cost of about $2.4 billion. And just for comparison, in Cleveland, for its consent decree, our local sewer authority is spending about $2.3 billion for CSO mitigation.
Well, Sandra, I love that party fact because I think combined sewer overflows is a really important issue, so I appreciate that you put it in that context. But I also like that it's a great way to end our interview here because it puts an emphasis on the fact that what you're doing with Vacant to Vibrant can have a significant environmental impact, and it can do so in a very cost-effective way. All right, well, thanks, Sandra, for taking the time to join us and to tell our listeners more about your great work around Vacant to Vibrant and otherwise. And hopefully we can go out and keep doing these projects that deliver so many benefits. So thank you for joining us and giving us your wisdom.
Thank you so much for the jokes.
Not as many benefits to those, but...
Right, you need to quantify the benefits of your jokes.
There's the $1 million idea. All right, well, thanks, Sandra.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. All right, Scott, like stormwater runoff, we need to manage the excess here, so I think it's time we wrap this episode up.
Let's do it, Jay.
All right, so listeners, before we close the show, we want to remind you to call us at our Google Voice number. What we're looking to do is feature your voicemails as audio clips on an upcoming episode. So again, what we want to do is share your stories about meaningful impacts you took after listening to our show. So call in, leave us a message, tell us who you are, what you heard on the show, what action you took, and the result. The number to leave us that voicemail is 202-670-7357. That's 202-670-7357.
And Jay, we didn't get anybody to call in when we mentioned this in the last episode, but this is a good chance. If you do this, you'll be on the show, and we intend to string together a bunch of these and make an episode out of it. So thanks for helping us out, and hopefully you enjoy hearing your voice on the show.
Scott, I remember when we had to get over that hump of hearing our own voices on the podcast, and listeners, this is your chance.
You've gotten over that hump?
Somewhat, I will say.
I haven't. No.
So we'd also like to thank Square Peg, Round Hole, and Potions for providing the music we use in our episode. We'd also like to thank Matt Aarons and Shannon Parker for helping us out with everything from strategic initiatives for the podcast to social media. They are both just crushing it.
And we also want to ask you all to please rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, but especially review it on Apple Podcasts, because then it shows up for people on their suggestions and things like that. So to encourage you to leave a review, we read a review every episode, and we got one on May 3rd, 2020 from The Simplicity of Things. This person named Julian, he titled his review Astounding, Top Tier, Bad Jokes, exclamation points after all those. And he says, Scott and Jay have kept me company on many long drives in my Prius. I've been listening for years, and I look forward to the first week of each month because of it. The episodes are a solid chunk of time, and they never drag. The horrid jokes are the cherry on top. You have, all caps, to listen to them, exclamation point. I find myself chuckling along to each of them without fail. These are the type of guys you'd love to have over for dinner, wine, and some homemade bread.
Baby.
Give them some of your time. It will be in great hands. A sustainable mindset is paramount to combat these bleak times, and I thank these two for their informative discourses. Julian.
I am just blown away. I'm blown away.
I mean,
I'm so touched.
Julian, if the offer is standing, I mean, we're there. Wine, homemade bread.
Listeners, we swear we didn't write this review. If we did, I don't think we could have made it this good. But again, I am just feeling warm and fuzzy inside, Scott.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to end this episode, Jay. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.